A university dean publicly mocks a quiet guest, has no idea. It's Morgan Freeman. Prestwick University's great lecture hall was humming with chatter, glass clinking, and sporadic bursts of laughter from groups of academics deep in concentration. It was the kind of place where status was flaunted rather than merely acknowledged, and titles counted more than names. Does actual intellect originate in degrees or wisdom? Comment 1 for wisdom. If you believe degrees alone define intelligence, 0. At the center of it all was Dean Harold Montgomery, a man whose very presence attracted notice. Tall, sharp-eyed, and always wearing a fitted suit, he was renowned for his rigorous intelligence and relentless belief in academic elitism. As Montgomery sometimes referred to it, tonight's event was meant to be an exclusive conversation on philosophy, ethics, and intellectual discourse, a conference of the minds. This was an occasion intended for persons with outstanding credentials, that is, with PhDs and published works under name. This is why Montgomery's curiosity soon turned into suspicion when his keen eye fixed on an unknown figure in the crowd, a man seated silently at the rear drinking his wine. Montgomery lifted his glass and murmured, "Ah, I see we have a guest tonight," fluidly. The audience turned, now fixed on the individual under inquiry. The man just looked up and gave a little courteous nod. "Tell me, sir," Montgomery said, his voice loaded with contempt, "which university did you earn your doctorate from?" The man grinned, his look uninterpretable. He said just, "I don't have a doctorate." The crowd erupted in laughter, quiet giggles mingled with informed smiles. Montgomery graced a small headshake. "Ah, I see," he said. "A self-taught philosopher. How refreshing." Laughing then, but not from the one who had attracted most attention. He stayed cool and completely unconcerned. "Tell me then," Montgomery continued, eyebrow raised, "what could someone without formal academic background possibly contribute to a discussion on philosophy among scholars?" The space became uncomfortably silent. Finally, the man set his drink down, gently corrected in his chair, and said, "Well," he continued, "for starters, I would remind you that knowledge is measured in understanding rather than degrees." Stillness. The air changed, a tension almost physical in density, and it was at that moment Montgomery and everyone else in the room understood their error. The man they had just laughed at, the one seated silently at the rear of the room, was Morgan Freeman. Montgomery had spent years applying his intelligence to make others feel small. Today he was about to discover that real wisdom cannot be hung on a wall. By the second, the suspense in the Prestwick University lecture hall thickened. The weight of unspoken ideas crushing on the academics sat around the room had caused the laughter that had filled the air minutes ago to fade into an unpleasant stillness. What had begun as a private conference of intellectual elites was now something far more difficult. Tonight, Dean Harold Montgomery anticipated to be like every other lecture he organized, a platform for him to highlight his intelligence, compel respect, and uphold the system that ranked academics above everything else. But now he felt uncertainty, something he hadn't felt in a long time, as he glanced at the man seated across from him, the man he had just tried to humiliate. For the man was not simply anyone, and Montgomery had made a mistake that would shortly become rather very obvious. Montgomery sipped his wine, trying to hide the little finger twitch. He had taken great satisfaction in being relentless, a master of rhetoric and intellectual argument. Still, this man, this unidentified visitor, unfit for a room full of intellectuals, had not wavered at his disdain. That wasn't usual. People flinches constantly. This man had not done any of those things. They stammered, reddened, laughed tensely. No, he had just sat there, calm, relentless, his presence sufficient to undermine the fundamental basis Montgomery had developed his power on. Montgomery dismissed it. "So," he said, his tone subtly soft, "since you believe understanding is more important than degrees, I'm sure you wouldn't mind sharing your views on the foundation of modern epistemology." A couple teachers cast quick looks at one another. It seemed to be a trap, an intellectual trap set just so. The bread and butter of philosophical academia was epistemology, the study of knowledge itself. This man would be revealed in a couple of seconds if he were simply another self-taught thinker with nothing except a few books and ideas. Sure he had turned the man into a corner, Montgomery leaned back in his chair. The man, though, just softly clinked his glass down on the table. "I would be delighted to," he responded. Montgomery's sneer wavered. The room slanted in that direction. The visitor folded his hands in front of him, his face insensible. His voice rich and methodical, he said, "Epistemology has been debated for centuries, spanning Socrates to Descartes, Kant to Quine. But the real question isn't about theory, it's about application." Montgomery shook his head. The man went on, his words coming naturally from experienced knowledge rather than from taught information. "Knowledge is not just the accumulation of facts, but also the ability to discern when to speak and when to listen," he remarked. His voice was subdued, cool, strong. "And the greatest failure of intellectualism," he said, staring exactly at Montgomery, "is mistaking credentials for wisdom." The room was filled with a ripple of vitality. Montgomery hesitated, because suddenly he understood he wasn't testing the guest. He was being tested by the guest. That evening, Montgomery experienced something alien, doubt for the first time. The weight of the academic's eyes changed, not on the guest, but on him. They were not merely observing a conversation now, they were seeing something far more profound. A professor changed their glasses someplace in the room, one more scribbled something in their notebook, and Montgomery detested it as well. He was the academically inclined person. It was he who had spent decades honing the art of intellectual conversation. He has argued beside some of the most brilliant academic brains. Still, at this point, he had nothing to say. The man was ruling the room, not only standing fast, and the worst aspect is still here. He was performing it with ease. Montgomery tried to push past the pain constricting his chest by clearing his throat. "An interesting point of view," he remarked, attempting a smile, "but I do wonder. Certainly you don't mean to suggest that formal education is unnecessary." He was doing what he knew, a well-placed inquiry, a gentle reorientation, just enough to get back under control. The man nodded to recognize the effort. "Not at all," he remarked. "Education is essential, but understanding and education are not the same things." Montgomery let out a quick inhale. Those words, that exact phrasing, came from one of the very thinkers he had spent years reading, and the guest understood it as well. Montgomery was lost among them. He was able to feel it. The room, his audience, his peers, was not looking to him for direction. They turned to face the guest, at the man who in 5 minutes had spoken more sensibly than Montgomery had in his 5-year career of presentations. Then, as if to mark the occasion, the visitor leaned forward slightly and then formally introduced himself. "My name is Morgan Freeman." The silence. All at once the awareness hit, exhales, stunned reactions. A teacher setting down their pen. Since all suddenly everything made sense. Existence, the assurance, the might. They hadn't been chatting to any random visitor. They had been addressing one of the most revered voices in contemporary society. And Montgomery had simply been trying to outsmart a man whose sheer presence demanded a degree of respect none degrees could ever purchase. The student had just been outclassed. Montgomery had entered this lecture thinking of knowledge as power, but today he was going to discover that real wisdom is something you cannot impart in a classroom. The space no longer belonged to Montgomery. One could hardly overlook the change in the air in the Prestwick University lecture hall. Dean Montgomery's once unwavering confidence started to fade, his carefully manufactured aura of superiority erasing through his fingers like sand. He had stood before chambers just like this one, enforcing an iron grip to make sure nobody, especially not an outsider, could question his authority for years. Still, tonight he sat across from a man who had just done it. Not by calling attention to it, not by means of vigorous argumentation, but just by being himself. And now, as the stillness passed between them, Montgomery understood something he had never thought of before. He had just made a mistake fronting an audience that would never forget it. As the intellectual power in the room, Montgomery could sense the stares and the weight of hundreds of eyes not looking to him. His pride, his lifetime reputation as an academic titan, would not let him let this stand. He thus followed his usual behavior when he sensed the tides running against him. He modified the regulations. Straightening in his seat, he pushed aside his humiliation with the simplicity of a man who had learned to control a discourse back in his favor. "Well then, Mr. Freeman," Montgomery replied deftly, the edge of contempt returning to his voice. "Since you seem to have such an appreciation for philosophy without a formal education, perhaps you would care to test that understanding." A whisper went around the assembly. Simply folding his hands in his lap, Morgan Freeman waited. Montgomery slanted forward, his eyes shining with fresh hope. "I would want to offer you a basic thought experiment," he began, his voice full of the assurance of a man sure he was still in charge. "One that is often discussed among great philosophers. If you can engage in a meaningful way, then perhaps we can consider your perspective really valuable." A few laughs floated about the space. Morgan remained unaffected. Montgomery smirked. "Let's say," he said, tweaking his cufflinks for dramatic effect, "that we place a person in a completely isolated environment from birth. No books, no education, no outside influence. If knowledge is not simply something we acquire, but rather something we inherently understand, then tell me, Mr. Freeman, what would this person know?" There was silence over the audience. It was a trick question, one Montgomery had frequently asked. The plan was to push his opponent into a no-win scenario. Either try to refute logic itself or accept that knowledge has to be taught, so conceding that education was better. Montgomery laid back in his chair. He had driven Morgan into a corner, or so he considered. Morgan moved slowly. The stillness lasted so long that a few audience members changed their seats. Finally, at last, he spoke. "A fascinating question," he continued, his voice calm and fluid, "and one that has been argued for centuries. But I believe the idea is flawed." The smile of Montgomery jerked. Rising an eyebrow, he remarked, "Oh?" Musk nodded. "You assume knowledge is something separate from experience," he continued, his voice calm but forceful. "That it is something which must be given rather than something which is observed, internalized, and interpreted." Montgomery's fingers tightened just on the table's edge. Morgan leaned forward very gently, his presence effortlessly filling the space without effort. "A child raised in isolation may not know how to read a book," he said, "but they will know how to recognize patterns. They will understand hunger. They will feel time. They will, in their own way, search understanding because that is human nature." Montgomery opened his mouth, but Morgan held up a hand, not as a command, but as a subdued assertion of dominance. "And more significantly," Morgan remarked, "they will not be limited by the arrogance of those who believe that only a certain kind of education can create intelligence." The room stopped completely. Montgomery's mouth tightened. Suddenly, Morgan was not only responding to the thought experiment anymore. Morgan was calling out everything Montgomery had created on reputation. For years, Montgomery had felt himself untouchable, a gatekeeper of information, a man whose degrees and published papers gave him power over all things intellectual. But now, for the first time, he saw himself through the eyes of the people around him, not as a respected academic, but as a man who had mistook snobbery for brilliance. Worst of all, Morgan Freeman had not needed one certificate to refute him. A gentle wave of comprehension passed throughout the audience. A few of the other teachers nodded gently, appreciating Morgan's comments' weight. A few kids looked at each other, their first amusement replaced with real interest. And Montross? Montgomery became caught. He understood that whatever he said going forward would not count. The room has made decisions beforehand. Morgan Freeman had already triumphantly prevailed. Montgomery let out a slow breathed, trying to hide the irritation developing on his face. "An interesting perspective," he murmured at last, his voice softer than it had been. Morgan only gave a small smile. "That's the thing about ideas," he remarked, his voice like rumbling thunder in the still room. "The best ones are discovered, they are not prescribed." A rear-of-the-room professor started to clap slowly. Once again. And another. Not for Montgomery, but for the man who had just completely changed the topic till the entire auditorium was ringing with applause. Montgomery sat still, his hold on the table tightening, because he entered this argument thinking he was the teacher. Still tonight, he had been the pupil. Montgomery had developed his career thinking knowledge made him unique, but today he discovered wisdom cannot be quantified by a degree. And subsequently, he would never forget that instruction. Montgomery's jurisdiction was no more the lecture hall. He had ruled over these halls for years, molding interactions and determining whose voices fit for hearing. His identity had been developed on the conviction that intelligence could be quantified, rated, and contained within academic walls. But tonight, for the first time, he found himself on the outside observing in. Morgan Freeman had not spoken out. He had not denigrated Montgomery with disparaging remarks or personal attacks. He had just said the truth. And now Montgomery grasped the most horrible aspect of all as he sat at the front of the room, his thoughts whirling for a means of control. This was not something one could bounce back from, since the room stopped listening to him. Montgomery sensed heat building on his face. The weight of the moment dropped on him, more weight than any speech he had ever given. Under the table, his hands clenched into fists, his polished facade breaking under the weight of an indisputable truth. He had lost. Montgomery, nevertheless, was not a man who gave up readily. He straightened in his chair, smoothed his suit jacket, and attempted a smile that fell short of exactly reaching his eyes. "Well," he continued, his voice purposely laid back, "I suppose that was a rather poetic response." Though they were feeble and doubtful, some laughs rippled throughout the room. "Though I have to say," Montgomery said, his tone sliding back into its customary disdain, "philosophy is a discipline of precision. It is not about grand speeches or sentimentality. It is about logic, about argument, about structure." Morgan stayed still, his face invisible. Montgomery stayed on. "So let's put aside the theatrics," he added, slant forward. "You claim that knowledge is measured in understanding rather than degrees. Fine, but let's test that understanding, shall we?" The room moved. If only gently, Montgomery could feel their focus returning to him. "Let's talk mathematics," he offered naturally. "Certainly, if wisdom is inherent, as you say, then you should have no trouble solving a basic equation in front of the class." There were whispers of gasps in the hall. A difficulty. One last try to bring control back within his grasp. Montgomery realized he had made a mistake, though, the instant the words came out of his mouth. Because Morgan grinned, not entertaining, not in haughtiness, but when a seasoned chess player sees their opponent's last move before they have even made it, they smile. Morgan leaned gently forward, hands interlocked. "A math problem?" he said again, his voice deliberate. "That's what you want me to evaluate?" Montgomery nodded, his confidence rising in spite of his nagging discomfort in his chest. "A basic one," he said fluidly. "Something every one of my pupils could fix while asleep." Turning to face the whiteboard behind him, he quickly, precisely wrote a difficult integral equation. When he was done, he turned back, grinning. "Take care to grab a shot." Morgan was standing. Though slow and deliberate, the movement seemed to be weighted toward inevitability. He moved, approached the board. The room was still so quiet that the scrape of the marker against the surface still hung in the air. Morgan looked at the calculation, slightly slanted head, then he accomplished something nobody predicted. Laughing, he said, not mockingly, not haughtily, nevertheless, gently, one they hadn't yet noticed, as if he were seeing a youngster commit a basic error. He turned back to Montgomery, and that marked the change. Knowing Montgomery allowed one to understand. He knew even before Morgan spoke or raised the marker. He had underpaid the incorrect individual. Turning back to the board, Morgan moved with deliberate, exact, easy effort. He raised the marker and rewrote the equation with one quick, sweeping stroke, not finding a solution for that, mending it. Montgomery stopped breathing. Realizing what was happening, the audience slanted forward. Morgan had repaired a fault in Montgomery's own arithmetic. Not only addressed the issue, he backed off, capped the marker, and turned. "It's not about knowing the answer," he remarked with an even, consistent, unquestionable voice. "It's about knowing when you have asked the wrong question." And the last of Montgomery's power broke precisely as that. Starting as a gradual ripple, the applause first seemed reluctant. It then expanded. Higher volume, unmistakable. Rising to their feet, some students clapped while others gazed in utter wonder at what they had just seen. Montgomery stayed motionless. Knowing this, he had recently gone without everything. The whispers of discourse became into something more. A change in power Montgomery could not reverse. His power had been contested in the past. Nothing like this, though. Never by a man without degrees, academic titles, or yet more respect in one evening than Montgomery had in his whole career. And the worst aspect is also here. Morgan had not done it out of haughtiness. He had basically said the truth. Montgomery gasped as his throat went dry. These days, his voice would not save him. He began, but he had nothing to say. Morgan nodded just slightly, almost as though to say, "It's okay. You knew nothing other than this." And more than anything else, that was what made this so terrible. Montgomery had never been worth Morgan's resentment, only his sympathy. Montgomery had spent his whole career thinking he was the brightest man in the room. Tonight, he had just learned the most terrible lesson of all. True wisdom isn't about proving you're correct. It is about realizing your mistakes. The cheers were unbearable. It was not the forced, courteous behavior expected of academics, praising one another following an unremarkable panel debate. This was unique. This was the kind of clapping Montgomery had not heard in years, real respect, one that held shock, appreciation, and something he had not heard aimed at anybody save himself. Furthermore, it was not for him. Montgomery sat still in his chair, his brain trying to make sense of what had just transpired. Using his intelligence, he had spent his life running rooms, writing stories, and claiming dominion in the field of academics. But suddenly, in one evening, he had been quiet. Not by insults, not by rage, but by something far worse. Through truth. And truth, when expressed by the appropriate person, was something that the most honored academic could not dispute. Montgomery's hands remained rested on the table. His fingers curved slightly and grasped nothing. His eyes stayed locked on the board where Morgan Freeman had meticulously, without conceit, without hate, repaired his own error. The shame burned, strong and deep. This was not only a loss in a theoretical argument, this was something far more intimate, because Montgomery had spent years honing himself into the kind of man who could not be challenged, who could not be outdone, who could not be corrected. Still, here he was, not defeated, in his own hall for lectures, by a man who had not even come here to contest him initially. Montgomery sucked hard, his throat parched. Not the type of respect he was accustomed to, but rather the kind of quiet, unsaid judgment that results when a room discovers the man they once believed was magnificent is in reality simply another imperfect human being. And it was in that suffocating hush that followed the ovation that Montgomery realized something he had never given any thought. Not among the sharpest men in the room was he. Moreover, he never had been. Montgomery cleared his voice, trying to get under control, but his confidence vanished. "Well," he continued, attempting a tight smile, "Mr. Freeman, you absolutely know how to command an audience." The crowd grew still, waiting to see out where he would take this. "Though, of course," he said, moving in his seat, "we must acknowledge that academia is not simply about having clever responses. It is about structure, about discipline, about—" He drew off, for Morgan was still staring at him, not in evaluation, not in triumph, but in something more sinister, comprehending. Montgomery felt his gut turn around, since Morgan Freeman felt nothing toward him, and that meant he had never even started out as a worthy opponent. Morgan nodded just slightly, as if realizing Montgomery had to say something. Anything, to save his dignity. Montgomery thus turned to the one path remaining. His voice softer than before, he remarked, "Perhaps tonight we have all learned something valuable." It was not the dramatic, forceful ending he had envisioned. It was not a confession of defeat, neither was a victory, though either, as he had already lost. Morgan Freeman slanted forward and rested his elbows on the table. "You know, Dean Montgomery," he remarked, his voice smooth, steady, final, "the most dangerous thing about knowledge is assuming you already have enough of it." Montgomery started to blink. The viewers let out a breath. "And the most dangerous thing about power," Morgan said, "is thinking it makes you immune to wisdom." The weight of the words descended over the space like a dense fog. Montgomery turned his back on it, since he knew exactly what had transpired. Morgan had not merely fixed his arithmetic, he was now seeing things differently. He had completely destroyed Montgomery's well-constructed image, not with force, but with pure confidence. And Montgomery had to listen for the first time in his life without option. The crowd followed Morgan as he got up from his chair. Scholars, teachers, and students who had years of defying Montgomery's authority were now gazing at someone else with the same respect. And it was not the dean either. Montgomery stayed in his seat while the audience erupted in once more applauding. But he knew this time it was not for him. The colleagues he had previously dominated, the kids he had once looked down on, they had seen something tonight that was invisible nowhere else, and Montgomery would never be able to demand their respect the same manner once more. Tonight, in front of his own audience, he had been reduced to what he most dreaded. Just another man believing he knew everything, until he encountered someone who really knew. Montgomery stayed sitting, staring at the vacant area where Morgan Freeman had recently been while the audience flowed out of the lecture hall. He said nothing for the first time in his life. Perhaps also just maybe that was precisely what he needed. Montgomery had spent his whole career thinking knowledge was about having all the answers. Tonight he discovered the most terrible reality of all. The smartest men are those who never stop learning. Once packed, the lecture hall was almost empty now. Long gone were the echoes of acclaim, now only the distant whispers of professors and students still reeling from what they had seen. Montgomery sat still, fixated on the area where Morgan Freeman had just seconds previously. He was not considering his next speech, his next paper, or how he could demonstrate his intellectual superiority for the first time in his entire career. He considered what it meant to learn really. Though it came slowly, the insight struck him more forcefully than any intellectual test he had ever taken. His life had been spent misreading information for wisdom. Intelligence, he had thought, was a fortitude constructed from degrees, credentials, and academic success. But tonight he was seeing the reality. Wisdom was not about knowledge of more. It had to do with improved understanding. Nothing book, no thesis, no lecture had ever taught him. Morgan Freeman had showed him. That true intelligence is determined by your application rather than by what you know. Montgomery felt the weight pressing on his chest was more than just humiliation as he slowly stood shaking hands with his suit jacket. Growth was it. Tonight he had acquired his most important lesson, not from a fellow teacher nor from a philosopher, but from a guy who had never required a degree to command a room. Montgomery turned to exit, stopping just at the threshold to glance back at the vacant lecture hall one last time. The most dangerous thing about knowledge is assuming you already have enough of it. Morgan's comments hung in the air, and this time Montgomery listened really. This story helps us to see that real wisdom is about keeping open to what we don't know, not about proving how much we know. Montgomery thought that intelligence was about supremacy, that knowledge was power only when it set you above others. But tonight he saw that without humility, power is useless. Morgan Freeman did not only prevail in a debate, he reinterpreted what it means to be really educated. In the end, the best brains are those that want to understand rather than those who try to be right.